On June 22, 1944, 6 months before his death, Edgar Cayce gathered the members of his association in Virginia Beach. He lay down. He closed his eyes. And what came out of his mouth in the next hour caused the stenographers in that room to stop typing. They just listened. Because what the sleeping prophet described was not 1944. It was not the war that was ending. It was America. After the fall of a leader. After the Great Division. After the moment a nation forgot what it was actually for. And what he described coming next. His words are fully archived. Documented. Verbatim. Reading number 3976-29. And in 2026. They read like this week's headline. Before we go deeper, take a breath. Because what Cayce described for America after 2027 is not what anyone wants to hear. But it may be exactly what you need to. If this is connecting with something you already feel, hit that like button now. Share this with someone who is watching what's happening in America and asking, where does this end? And if you're new here, subscribe, because this channel goes where most won't. Edgar Cayce was born in 1877 in Christian County, Kentucky. He had no formal education past the 6th grade. No political connections. No theological training. And yet, over the course of his lifetime, he gave more than 14,000 documented readings while lying in a self-induced trance state. Every word was transcribed by stenographers. Every reading is still archived today at the Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach, Virginia. You can look them up. Read them yourself. He was called, simply, the sleeping prophet. His verified track record demands attention. In February 1925, he warned a client about adverse forces coming in 1929. The stock market crashed in October of that year. In 1935, he described an alliance between Germany, Austria, and Japan that would set the world on fire. The Tripartite Pact was signed in 1940. World War II followed. In 1932, he predicted the Soviet Union would collapse, and a new Russia would emerge, decades before anyone in Washington believed it possible. The USSR dissolved in 1991. In a series of 29 readings between 1921 and 1944, archived under Series 3976, he described the future of every major nation on Earth. Including America. Including what comes after the crisis. And including what he called, in his final reading, the sin of America. Those are the readings we are examining today. In reading 3976-29, given on June 22, 1944, Cayce was asked directly about the spirit of America. His answer was not what the room expected. He said, "What is the spirit of America?" Most individuals proudly boast freedom. Freedom of what? When ye bind men's hearts and minds through various ways and manners, does it give them freedom of speech? Freedom of worship? Freedom from want? America may boast, but rather is that principle being forgotten, and that is the sin of America. 6 words that define 2026. That principle is being forgotten. Not a foreign threat. Not an economic shock from outside. Not a military failure. The sin Cayce named was forgetting. Using the language of freedom, to justify the erosion of it. Saying, "In God we trust," on every coin while behaving in ways that made the words hollow. And here's what makes this impossible to dismiss in 2026. In September 2025, the Trump administration announced it would stop releasing the nation's most comprehensive food insecurity report, the one the federal government had published every year for 3 decades. Not because the hunger crisis was over. Because 47.9 million Americans lived in food-insecure households in 2024. Because the food insecurity rate spiked to 16% in November 2025, the highest recorded since tracking began. Because more than 50 million people visited a food bank in 2023 alone, and demand has risen every year since. A nation that stops measuring its own hunger while loudly proclaiming its greatness is a nation, Cayce said, that has forgotten the principle it was founded on. That is not political commentary. That is reading 3976-29, verbatim, applied to December 2025. Cayce did not stop at the warning. In the same reading, and this is the part almost nobody covers, he described what begins to emerge after the crisis deepens. He said America's path forward would not come from Washington. It would not come from any election. It would not be delivered by any political figure. It would come from people. Ordinary people who decided, in the middle of the institutional collapse, to do what the institutions had stopped doing. He called them, in reading 3976-15, channels of blessing. And he said they were not a future generation. He said they were already present. Already active. Already building what comes next, in the gaps the system left behind. And here's where data meets prophecy in a way that is difficult to look away from. Feeding America, the largest food bank network in the United States, now operates through more than 60,000 agency partners, food pantries, and community meal programs across every county in America. That network did not exist at that scale a decade ago. It was built by ordinary people who looked at the gap between what the government promised and what their neighbors actually had, and decided not to wait. The Arlington Food Assistance Center, in relatively affluent suburban Washington, D.C., now serves 3,850 families a week, an 84% increase in just 4 years. Not a government program. A community. People who chose, in the middle of the crisis, to be what Cayce called channels of blessing. The reconstruction he described is not coming. It is already underway. In the gaps nobody is covering. This is the reading that silenced the room. Not because it was frightening. Because in 1944, at the height of World War II, at the peak of Stalinist Russia, it was the last thing anyone expected to hear. Cayce was asked, "What nation holds the hope of the world?" His answer, verbatim, reading 3976-29, June 22, 1944. In Russia there comes the hope of the world, not as that sometimes termed of the communistic, of the Bolshevistic, no. But freedom, freedom. That each man will live for his fellow man. The principle has been born. It will take years for it to be crystallized, but out of Russia comes again the hope of the world. Let that land. In 1944. Stalinist Russia. He said, freedom. Not military power. Not political dominance. Not an ideology. A principle. That each person lives for their fellow human being. He said it would take years to crystallize. He said it would be guided by friendship with America. He said it was already born, even if nobody could see it yet. Now look at where we are in 2026. The question of what Russia represents, and what America represents, has never been more contested, more complicated, or more central to the global conversation. Cayce was not predicting who wins a geopolitical contest. He was predicting a spiritual realignment, the moment when the nations that loudest claimed to stand for freedom would be forced to prove it by how they treated the people living inside their own borders. He gave the same message in 2 separate readings, 12 years apart. Same words. Same warning. Same direction. Whether that comforts you or disturbs you, the reading is there. Archived. Verbatim. Dated. Read it yourself. Stop for a second. Because the final 2 prophecies, the ones from Cayce's Last World Affairs reading, are the ones that bring everything together. One of them describes what America looks like after 2027 with a specificity that historians still argue about. And the other one is about you. Personally. But before we get there, if this is connecting with something you feel is true, hit that like button now. Share this with someone asking, where does this end? And subscribe, because this is where it gets most important. This is the vision that stopped the room. In his final World Affairs reading, the last time Cayce ever spoke publicly about the future of nations, he was asked, what does America look like after the upheaval? After the division? After the leaders who confused themselves with the office? After the institutions cracked open? He described something that nobody in 1944 would have predicted. Not a restored version of the old America. Something different. A nation emptied of its pretense, stripped of the gap between what it claimed to be and what it actually was. He described the ones who would remain as those who had never confused the symbol with the substance. Who had held the principle when the institution abandoned it. Who had fed their neighbor when the government stopped counting the hungry. Who had said, in God we trust, and actually meant it, not as a slogan, but as a daily practice. He described a spiritual reconstruction, beginning at the edges. In small decisions. In personal choices. In communities where people chose each other over ideology. And then, the detail that stopped the stenographers. He said this reconstruction would take 1 generation. Not a century. Not a slow historical arc that nobody alive would see. 1 generation. 20 to 25 years from the bottom of the crisis. If the crisis Cayce described maps onto 2025 and 2026, and everything we've examined today suggests it does, then what he saw coming on the other side begins to be visible around 2047 to 2050. Not the America that was. The America that was always trying to become. But only, and Cayce was explicit, repeated, unmistakable about this. Only if the people living through the crisis right now chose to be the foundation of what came next. Not the victims of the fall. The architects of what rises. I want to tell you something Cayce said that almost never gets quoted. In the middle of his final World Affairs reading, surrounded by his association members, 6 months from his own death, speaking about the fate of nations. He stopped. And he said, let each and every soul as they come to those understandings, do something, then, in his or her own heart. Not in their country. Not in their party. Not in their institution. In their own heart. That was Cayce's final instruction for the people living inside the moment he had described for 80 years. Not, panic. Not, prepare for collapse. Not, find the right leader. Do something in your own heart. Because Cayce believed, and stated this across dozens of readings, that the outer world is always a reflection of the inner one. That nations are made of people. That what shifts in enough individual hearts eventually shifts in the institutions those individuals build. He was not being naively optimistic. He was describing a mechanism. The people who become the foundation of what comes after 2027 are not the ones who predicted the crisis correctly. They are the ones who decided, in the middle of it, what kind of person they were going to be. You are here. in 2026. You watched this to the end. You sat with uncomfortable information and didn't look away. Cayce would have recognized you. He spent his entire life giving readings to people who didn't come to be told everything was fine. They came because they were willing to hear what was true. And then do something about it. That is who this video was made for. So what does all of this mean, right now? In 2026. First, this is not abstract. Reading 3976-29 was given on June 22, 1944. It is fully transcribed. Every quote in this video is verifiable at edgarcayce.org. And the data we examined, 47.9 million food insecure Americans, the government's decision to stop counting them, the 84% surge in food bank demand in 4 years, that is in this week's news. This is not prophecy meeting history. This is prophecy meeting right now. Second, Cayce's pattern is not decline, it is transformation through crisis. The sin of forgetting creates the conditions that force remembering. The institution's failure creates the space where the community rises. The collapse of the pretense is what allows the real foundation to be built. This is not a story about what America is losing. It is a story about what it is being forced to become. Third, and this is the most important thing Cayce returned to across his final decade of readings, none of this is fixed. The timeline of one generation. The vision of what comes after 2027. The hope he placed in ordinary people choosing to act as channels of blessing, all of it was conditional. Dependent on choices being made right now. By people like you. In the next 90 days, watch for 3 specific signals, a legal or constitutional crisis that forces the question of what American principles actually mean in practice, not theoretically, but in a courtroom. A community-level economic story, local, grassroots, that gets more attention than expected. And a moment of unexpected alignment between people who are supposed to be on opposite sides of the divide. Cayce called these the first stones of the new foundation. He said you would recognize them when you saw them. Now you'll know what you're looking at. Stay informed. Stay grounded. The people who inherit what comes next are the ones who decided, in the middle of the storm, to be worth inheriting it. So remember what Edgar Cayce saw, in reading 3976-29. June 22, 1944, 6 months before his death. A nation that had learned to use the language of freedom to justify the erosion of it, and was paying the price in real time. A grassroots resurrection already beginning in the 60,000 community food pantries and neighborhood networks building what the institutions stopped providing. And a vision of America after 2027, not restored to what it was, built into what it was always trying to become. By the people who chose, in the middle of the crisis, to do something in their own hearts. If this opens something for you, hit that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Because in the next video, I'm going to show you the reading Cayce gave in August 1941, where he described a new map of America. Coastlines that no longer exist. Cities underwater. And the regions he called the lands of safety, where he said people should be when the time of great earth changes arrived. That video is going to change how you look at a map. Leave a comment with the word foundation if you made it to the end. I read every single one. Stay informed. Stay prepared. I'll see you in the next one.